Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Well, hi there, Exponential Australia. Again, we're so glad that you've joined us both online by way of these video interviews, or if you're joining us on our podcast. We're just so glad that you've taken the time to again hear from such a wide range of Aussie and global leaders when it comes to multiplication and church planting. And really our hope and prayer to see more churches in Australia be planted all across our great land. And today we are joined by a very well-known leader in Australia who's leading a fantastic church. Many of you would have heard of City on a Hill, and today we are joined by their senior pastor, Guy Mason. And Guy, we're just so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Charlie. It's great to connect with you, and yeah, g'day to everyone who's tuning in. Really, really wonderful to be part of the conversation.
Awesome. Well, Guy, City on a Hill, as I already mentioned, is a relatively well-known church here in Australia with multiple campuses, both in Victoria, Queensland and New South Wales. I wonder, for those who maybe haven't heard some of the City on a Hill journey, if you would just paint a bit of a sketch of what the Lord has done. You guys were planted in 2007 and have since grown to multiple locations. Would you just give us a bit of a storyline of how that's happened, and even some of your journey into planting City on a Hill would be really helpful too?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I think for me, I wasn't raised in a Christian home, Charlie, and I raised in Melbourne myself, in a family. We never went to church, didn't own the Bible, thought Jesus was nothing more than a swear word. But I think, like a lot of Australians, certainly had big questions about life and this world. And I was a very inquisitive kid. I think I grew up experiencing some of the good things of life, but also some of the difficult things. So my parents separated when I was young. My brother lived on the streets for a period of time. And so there was a lot of uncertainty and chaos, and kind of those worlds collided for me as a young kid and had me asking questions. And probably when I was a teenager, actually, about 14, 15, I was gifted with a Bible. My best mate at school was a Christian, and his sister gave me a Bible. And reading about Jesus, was a Good News Bible, the one that came with pictures. And reading about Jesus, for the first time, I remember it like yesterday, Charlie. I was just captivated by who Jesus is. And the way he loved people with such authenticity and sacrifice, the way he challenged religious hypocrisy, the way he cared for people, the way he spoke the truth. For me, it was life-changing. And for me, it really ignited a passion for two things. I want to know this Jesus, and I want to make Jesus known. And moving forward, for me, I never anticipated or expected I'd ever be a church planter or pastor or anything like that. I very much wanted to be helping people come to know Jesus, and, to be in the public square, marketplace, working in those kind of spheres. But by God's grace, I was, encouraged into church ministry, and then stumbled across really this opportunity to help plant a church. And so, as you said, 2007, my wife and I joined what was effectively a small group Bible study. It was a partnership between St Jude's Anglican Church and the oldest Anglican church in Melbourne, St James Old Cathedral. They had partnered together with a hope and a prayer to see a new church planted. And so my wife and I joined a team. There must have been, 9, 10 there. I think a few people left in the first week once they met me, and we were off to a great start. And really, I'd never led a church before, never planted a church before, but was passionate about the city that I live in. Very much see myself as a missionary in Melbourne, and just praying that God might use us and help people come to know Jesus. So that was 2007. And, by God's grace, we've been kind of seeking to proclaim Jesus, know Jesus, make Jesus known ever since.
Wow, Guy, and I love that even in your early childhood, and as you began to recognise what Jesus was all about, that you recognised that led to making him known. What an incredible journey for that to have happened within you, and then more broadly within the church.
Yeah, my assumption is that once I encountered the gospel was that well, this is good news. I knew growing up that I was living my own life. I think I would have instinctively, I wouldn't have called it sin, but I understood what that meant. I knew that, God was very distant, if it does even exist. And I certainly knew I was living my own life and trying to find my own happiness and doing a whole bunch of foolish things. So then to discover that when Jesus went to the cross, he died and had me in mind. So I didn't need convincing that I was a sinner. I needed convincing of God's grace and that he would forgive me and welcome me. And so I think when first time I went to the church and I heard the gospel proclaimed, I was like, yeah, I'm in. And then I went back the second week, they did the same altar. I'm like, yeah, I'm in. And then I think it was like the 16th week in a row where someone said, you don't need to keep coming forward. You're a Christian now. And it's to me, like evangelism is, you love Jesus and you talk about what you love. If we saw a great movie, we'd talk about it. I saw Batman with my eldest boy and loved it. I've told about 28 people about it. So wow. Same is true for I think when you encounter the wonder and the glory of Jesus. We don't always do that. I get embarrassed or I'm nervous of what somebody thinks. But when Jesus is alive in me and I'm connected with him, then yeah, I want to share that with other people.
Yeah, that's awesome, Guy. Are you pro Robert Pattinson? That's probably the most important question.
Say that again. Who's he?
Robert Pattinson.
Oh. Didn't even know I'm like, is this some political leader? They should be on Stop Up. I have no idea. Is he the actor?
He is. Yeah. Anyway,
I think he did a really good job.
That's awesome.
He did a really good job. Clearly, I was paying attention.
Absolutely. Well, from 2007, why don't you tell us about some of the journey? Like, it's been 15 years. You've planted multiple campuses. Tell us of some of the highs and the lows and the journey of City on a Hill.
Yeah. Well, by God's grace, we started in a pub. God had, gifted us with this great venue, and we started. And I think what was really, really encouraging is that from the get-go, and I appreciate this doesn't happen for every church, so I think it was quite unique for us. But people started to gather, and people started to bring their unbelieving friends, and people gave their life to Jesus. I was the classic guy who was like, Lord, if just one person gives their life to Jesus, it'll be worth it. And we started to see that very early on. We were in the pub, and back in those days, the media actually thought we were baptizing people in beer. We weren't. It certainly made for some good headlines.
Yeah.
But people started coming along, and it started to grow. And we were committed from the get-go to multiplication, and very committed to knowing Jesus and making Jesus known. And so that meant early on creating a second service, or then a third service, and then finding a new location. And then, I think it was about 5 years in, Charlie, that we were able to really, I suppose, help in beginning a pathway of planting and multiplication. That's not always easy, and I'm happy to, talk about some of the challenges in that. But Andrew Grills, who I'd known for many years, was looking to plant a church, and we had a good relationship. And so he ended up coming alongside us and being part of City on a Hill and planting our first church in Geelong. And that really set a new trajectory for us going forward. We, by God's grace now, would see ourselves as one movement, 8 churches. And you mentioned all the various different places that those churches, and they're different shapes and different sizes and made up of course, different people. But Lord willing, we hope to one day, praying that we'd see 50 churches in 10 cities, all seeking to reach people with the beauty, truth, and relevance of Jesus. That's the hope. That's the prayer. That's the dream. That's what we're trying to work out. We've made a lot of mistakes along the way. I've made a ton of mistakes along the way. We're failing forward. We're praying. We're seeking to learn, seeking to do what we can so that we can serve people, love people, care for people, and proclaim Christ.
Praise God, Guy. And at Exponential, we're absolutely cheering you on in that vision. I think that's so
Thanks,
exciting to hear that, that's the direction that you guys are going in. And I guess the next question that I would have is particularly from the get-go, like you talked about that quite early on in City on a Hill's journey, multiplication was seeded. And when you kind of think that way and you're thinking multiplication rather than necessarily, staying where you are at this present point, when it came to engineering or considering the strategy forward for City on a Hill with multiplication in mind, how did that change the way that you thought as a leader, that the church strategized into the future, that the board function, like all of those different questions that we have as church leaders to actually bring about multiplication?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in some sense, if you've planted a church, there is, a clear framework and at least philosophy that's driving what you do. So I'm obviously a big believer, as I'm sure you are, in that we're a sent people. In Jesus, prayer, he sends us out, and then in Matthew 28, he sends us out. And so I've always understood the identity of the church not as this like hidden away club, but as a missional movement. In fact, when I planted the church, and got the core group together, that was the question that I wanted to kind of us to wrestle with. What would mission-shaped church, such a go-to phrase back then, but what does a mission-shaped church look like, in a post-Christian context? So what would it mean for us to be a sent people? So I think for us, it was very much part of our language, very much part of our DNA. And that is that we existed to know Jesus, right? God's people drawing near to him, loving him, serving him. And as an overflow of our love and affection for Jesus, we're making him known. So you see in the gospel, don't you? Jesus seeking to save the lost. So you ask the question, well, I'm following Jesus. Where's Jesus going? He's going to seek and save the lost. So we want to join him in that. And so I think the moment that you see your unity and your union with Christ, who is going into the world seeking to save the lost, then the church has to create room for multiplication. It has to be thinking in terms of multiplication. Now, whether that's a small church and it's like, well, we've got one, we call them gospel community, right? Already that gospel community must be praying for unbelievers to join. It must be praying for leaders to be raised up. It must be praying for an opportunity to multiply and to seek out the things of God and to seek his people. So even in the very beginnings, that was part of our language. And church planting for us was, the grounding for that we see is biblical. Yeah. You see you ask the question, how did the early church, how did the disciples respond to the Great Commission? Well, they went to towns and cities, planting churches, establishing communities, preaching the gospel. So you see that biblically, practically. We talked a lot about how church planting seeds, is a great vehicle for evangelism. So we'd talk about these kinds of things, and then we'd make room for church planting. How we budget, how we structure, who we hire. All of this really seeks to serve what we celebrate in the church. All of this seeks to serve church planting. I'm happy to unpack any of that, but they're just some kind of headlines.
Oh, that's phenomenal, Guy. And it really does get each and every one of us within God's church, whether small or large or anywhere in between, to go, multiplication is possible. It's just about thinking about, for my context, where I'm at, what can be the next step that we are taking in multiplying ourselves for the sake of the glory of Jesus. Obviously, it's no secret that this last season in life in church ministry has been a tough one. There's been lots of learnings for us as leaders, but for us as the capital C church. I wonder if I were to ask you, what has been your biggest learning in this past season, to do with the pandemic, but also as we kind of, I wouldn't dare say come out of the pandemic, because we're pseudo coming out of the pandemic, but the opportunities that exist for us as leaders and churches, hopefully very much in the vein of church planting into the future. But what have been the things that have been impressed upon you at this time?
Oh, it's such a great question, Charlie. And there's just so much I suppose, to talk about here. I'll start with an observation, and that is that, I spent some time in Chicago with, we were talking about it before, with other leaders who are leading in large churches. And one of the things that was interesting just to hear is that, our experience, in Melbourne, which was the most locked down city in the world, there's a lot of commonality with churches right now, at least in the West, in terms of not everybody returning back to church, churches being low on volunteers, and like that the outer crowd in the church no longer present, hasn't quite returned. Rhythms to church engagement have changed, and it's just been interesting to see that at a cultural level, not just in Melbourne but across Australia and indeed around the world. That impact, which isn't just about COVID. There was obviously a whole bunch of things leading up to this moment, but there's just been rapid cultural change, social and cultural and spiritual disruption that have really challenged the church. So I think the last 2 years have been incredibly hard for leaders, incredibly hard for people to navigate and to bring people together. I mean, as a pastor, I'm called to love God and to love people. And yet throughout COVID, people were displaced, people were isolated, people were hurting, and you couldn't just get them all together. And it was very hard to go to people, and it was very hard to find people. So there were a lot of challenges in that. Having said all that, I also felt that the experience was refining and renewing in a unique kind of way. For a start, I think it did challenge me, and I'm sure so many other leaders, when it came to innovation. Because City on a Hill, we've been going for, we celebrate our 15th anniversary this year. And I remember, I think it was, I was chatting with Matt Chandler, who's president of Ep.22, and he was talking about, and I don't know if this illustration is unique to him, but how the Sunday service is a bit like the Queen piece on a chessboard. Have you heard this? I just thought it was a really, really good analogy. And he was saying how really experienced chess players practice their game of chess without the Queen, right? In other words, how do I make use of all the different pieces on the board and don't just rely on the Queen? And, for churches, particularly large churches, that their Sunday gatherings is such a kind of like a peak moment. How do we do ministry? How do we do mission when we can't gather? We weren't able to gather in any real consistency for like 2 years, and there's limitations and restrictions. And so what was encouraging, though hard, was the innovation. How do we serve people in new ways? How do we get people together in new ways? How do we depend upon God in new ways? How do we love people in new ways, right? So that was really, really challenging, but also really, really inspiring. One of the illustrations we've, talked about as a team is the historical moment, but also a movie of Dunkirk, right? Where you've got the soldiers stranded on this beach and they're trying to work out, how do we get to them? How do we rescue them? We can't use the traditional means that we once have. So what do? They send in all of those little boats, everyday people crossing the channel, everyday people part of that. And I think, wow, that in some sense, the disruption of COVID-19 inspired that kind of work. Now, we didn't nail all of this, right? We made a lot of mistakes, and sometimes we were running too fast and other times probably a little bit too slow. But it was exciting to see God's people get in those little boats and trying new things. So there are a few initial thoughts I have on that.
They're brilliant, Guy. And I think, I would tend to agree with you that one of the really exciting things that is coming out of this season, I hope, for the Aussie church, is those everyday men and women who are kind of feeling called to the gospel and hands-on, going about the Great Commission. That hasn't changed, but there's probably been a reminder for the Aussie church to come back to that, which I think is really exciting. The kind of last question for our time together, guys, particularly around leadership. I think one of the great challenges that I hear from a lot of the Australian church and in planters and network leaders is particularly around raising up leaders and future planters. And it seems to me there is no lack of vision or even resource for the Australian church. But one of the great challenges is finding the right planters and the right people who will go about planting churches, irrespective of tribe or denomination. And of course, as an Ep.29 church, you guys are very well recognised for your assessment and deployment of planters. I wonder if you want to speak to just the way that City on a Hill has gone about kind of identifying future planters and opportunities to raise them up, give them, service opportunities within City on a Hill, and then see them to be planted elsewhere and see about new gospel communities coming about.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one we're still very much trying to learn and work out. I think the first thing I would say is it's really, really important in a church to be open as to the various modes or styles of leadership that can emerge. I think sometimes we get in a certain pattern, which is the leader needs to look and sound and act exactly like this. We have really tried to open up the door and be open to how the Spirit might move and who God might raise up and how they might be raised up. So if you were to look over City on a Hill and the various men and women who are serving, you're going to see a lot of very different people. Even among our lead pastors, we've got 8 lead pastors across our 8 churches now. They're all unique and distinct and wonderful in their own unique ways. And their journey with us is unique. Some have joined us really since the beginning of the church and worked in different roles and served in different roles and then were sent out with a big core team. Others approached us from externally and said, hey, we love what God is doing at City on a Hill. Can I come and do an internship with you guys and spend some time with you? And moved into the area and worked. And then they were sent out, almost like parachute style of church planting. So we've tried to be open-handed on how we might train up leaders. We have a church planting residency. We have internships. We have lots of different roles and positions. And really, really trying to work hard, not just on the competency of a leader, but of the character and the chemistry and the culture that is important for us going forward. So that would be one thing I would say. The other really big thing for us, Charlie, is we've talked a lot about this concept called gospel confidence. And it's been, a phrase that we use a lot, we talk about. And it's this idea that you would appreciate in Australia that, there is something of a tall poppy syndrome where we like to cut down our leaders. And so for a Christian, it's really quite challenging because we don't want like self-absorbed leaders. We don't want leaders lording it over others. We want humble, courageous, and sacrificial leaders. So where do they find the confidence to do big things? Where will they find the confidence to step out in faith? For us, that confidence comes in the gospel, right? Our courage comes from the gospel. I think of, people like Moses, right, who had a stutter and was fearful and fled from Egypt. Yet his life was turned around at the burning bush. Why? Because he had a revelation of who God is, right? The great I am, bigger than him. He had a clarity on God's mission in the world, right? I hear my people. They are in suffering. They need help, right? I have a rescue plan. And number 3, that great affirmation and promise. When Moses is nervous, he wants out. And what does God say? He says, I will be with you, Moses, right? So it's not about his strength. It's not about his ability. It's not about his gifting. It's about the presence of God. And then if you go to like Matthew 28, you see this all the way through the Bible. When Jesus gets his disciples together and sends him out, it's not about their giftedness or their skills. He says, all authority in heaven has been given to me. In other words, it's about who Jesus is. Go therefore, make disciples. In other words, I have a mission in this world. And what's the promise? I will be with you to the end of the age. So I think fundamental in a culture of leadership is remembering the glory and the magnitude of God, his mission in our world, and the promise that he goes with us. Australia, as you know, is an intimidating culture, right? It's a secular culture. It's a culture made up of pre-Christians and post-Christians. Very intimidating. It's hard ground. And yet as believers, we can step out in faith knowing that God is with us. I love the gospel for that reason. I love seeing it work in people's lives.
Guy, I'm inspired by your gospel confidence, and that's my prayer for everyone that's listening today, is that the Aussie church would believe again that there is a great harvest field out there and that we can play our part in seeing many, many people come to know Jesus. So I want to thank you for your time today, Guy.
Thanks, Charlie.
Inspiring us, and we're cheering on City on a Hill into the future.
Awesome, mate. Godspeed.
Thanks for listening. For more great resources, please head to our website at exponential.org.au.